move my email. What's what?
No, there's.
All right. So chapter 16 tomorrow. If I really don't think they'll cancel, but they do, we'll just move it to Thursday. We'll make do, whatever. Not a big deal. And those are good. I was gonna tell you something else, but I can't remember what.
Ally, really good wrapping this up.
I got nothing for it. I'm totally lost. I'm gonna buy a book. All right, so. We get to Arlington? Is that where we finished March of the Sea? All right, so we just got right to the done with the March of the Sea. Let's go and finish it, just a couple things, and then we'll go from there. Did I show you the crab-based history? We get the Sherman neckties?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is it called where you take the war to the enemy's people, you break their will, you make people suffer? What's it? And even though we didn't use the term yet, who do we kind of give credit's really the wrong word for it, but yeah, Sherman. And what city did they just capture? Yeah, and what other city was captured that allowed Lincoln to win the election? Close. Nashville was a really big battle. Mobile. I know there's lots of names throw at you. And then, so we got the Sherman's neckties, and they arrived at Savannah, and they arrived right before Christmas and took it. But I know what you're thinking. I want to have a good version of this history. The Chester the Crab version of history. So here's Chester the Crab. See, here's the crab. Where's right there? Tell me. Sorry, see the crab? And this is the whole book of American history from the point of view of a crab. That's pretty cool, isn't it? There's a whole book. This should have been our textbook. And so they see this is the march through, and they're chasing pigs. Yeah, just chasing pigs, having fun. And then they burned. Just having fun. And they arrived, and Sherman would send a note to Lincoln, basically saying, "This is your Christmas present, the city of Savannah." And there's rejoicing all through the note. You know, it's like another great victory. Okay, the book is actually kind of funny. It's not bad, actually. Should we do everything else crab based?
Yeah.
I don't trust crabs. They know no loyalty. I don't know. Chester. So it was Christmas Day. I put this in Harper's Magazine, 1864. Lincoln reelected, and I do kind of the closer to what's going to become a Christmas, but also indoctrinating the next crew of soldiers for the next war, I guess. And after Sherman took Savannah, they moved into South Carolina, and they really laid waste to South Carolina. Because what began in South Carolina? That's where secession began. So they destroyed South Carolina. In fact, the orders when he went into North Carolina, went into there in March, the orders were end. No more just complete destruction, because now North Carolina is not the same as South Carolina. Oh yeah, they still destroyed a lot, but nothing like they did through South Carolina. Just kind of swamped through it. And they're moving up north to Virginia. And one more thing. General Sheridan, the same general who took Missionary Ridge, the same general came in charge of the cavalry. He was given the orders to destroy the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley, beautiful valley right here, kind of the breadbasket of Virginia. The Confederates had done a raid, attacking out through the Shenandoah Valley towards Washington, D.C. And they even got to attack some of the forts around Washington, D.C. It was just purely a raid to try to take pressure off of Petersburg. In fact, Monocacy and then Fort Stevens were two battles. Lincoln actually went out to Fort Stevens. It's one of the forts defending Washington. He was like, "Oh, I can go watch the fighting," and went out there to go see it. And he was walking along the trenches that are built in front of the fort. And he's walking there, this 6'4" guy with a massive hat on, and he's walking around, he's kind of taking a peek, looking over at the Confederates. And some private was kind of ducking down and saw this guy doing it. He said, get your damn full ass down. And Lincoln said, oh, sorry. So I think that's really funny. He said that to the president. And then, with that, they just, Grant ordered Sheridan to go in this valley and make sure it could never be used again. And they laid waste to it. The story was not even a crow was flying after Sherman's army went through there. They destroyed it, just like the march through Georgia. And the reason I'm telling you this is that we're going to have, by 1870, President of the United States is going to be Ulysses S. Grant. The commander of the U.S. Army is going to be William Tecumseh Sherman. And the commander of the Department of the West, it's called the Department of the Missouri, was Phil Sheridan. And they will be responsible for the actions that are going to destroy the various tribes that are still resisting. And they will bring those same horrific tactics to the West. Force them to go on reservations. And this is the battle, the war they knew. And it will be horrific. So with that, we're jumping right to here. So we didn't mention our own. General Meigs was the Adjutant General of the United States Army. Meigs is responsible for all, not only supplies, responsible for various logistics, as we would use the term today. That term really didn't exist then, but also cemeteries for the thousands who have died from the wilderness down to Petersburg. One of those dead was his son. And he personally blamed one man for his son's death. And in fact, that man's plantation was just across the river from Washington, D.C., in this little town called Arlington. Your little town. So Meigs confiscated that plantation and turned that into the most hallowed ground in the United States. I know Lee's plantation. So it was Lee's plantation. He took Robert E. Lee's plantation. If you go there today, that is Lee's plantation. The Park Service runs it, and behind are the slave quarters. Lee got rich selling his surplus slaves downriver to plantations in Mississippi. He was already very wealthy, not even rich. And he never went back to his home. And it's almost full. It's almost full. It should be full in the next couple of years. Just someplace else to bury it. If you get a chance to go to Washington, D.C., and I think some of you probably have, if you haven't gone there, go there. It's really something. When I was there, the very first time we're walking on, my wife and I, and it's a little bit overwhelming. We're walking along, and I just happened to look at it at a gravestone, like literally right there, and it was partridge. It was a partridge from Ohio. So probably related, because there's a bunch of partridges from Ohio, which is one of those weird, surreal things. So the Confederacy held out. It's still holding. The Army of the West is gone, and it's still holding. Lee's army is still holding in front of Petersburg. But in the night of the 2nd and 3rd, it finally collapsed. They were literally out of food. Hundreds of men were deserting every night by March. I'm good. There. Coming for you. No. And so with that, they were so, a couple hundred men were deserting every night by March. They were so short of food, and the rail lines were so rickety and falling apart. And the only place to get food now was North Carolina. They weren't sending anything. And they were literally starving because they cut this off. They were reduced to eating ground up corn cobs and sawdust. So they would miss corn cobs, the shells of chickpeas, and sawdust to make kind of a bread. And as it went on, more and more sawdust. And the thing about sawdust is it filled their stomach. So they didn't have that horrific pain of not having the stomach. It just did horrible things to the intestines. I'll let you imagine it yourself. But that's how bad they were. In fact, they were so desperate. In March, in January, they proposed arming slaves and giving them their freedom if they fight for the Confederacy. Doesn't it kind of throw out the entire positive good theory, the whole reason they're fighting? By March, They even proposed ending slavery, hoping Britain would intervene. So the whole thing was falling apart. Well, on the 2nd, Meade's army just about cut off the last rail link. The Confederates tried to counterattack and failed, and they retreated. They had no choice but to pull out. And they ran as fast as they could westward. Those are Confederates that surrendered on the march westward because they were starving, they're straggling. Thousands of men couldn't make it. Here is one young soldier in the Confederate line on 3rd of April. Part of the rear guard was killed and had to be left there. So they snapped his picture. And not only does he look just like a walking or a scarecrow, is what I meant to say. Look how young he looks. He looks your age. Maybe young for a soldier. I mean, I guess not too young. Well, when that happened, Richmond fell too. They had no choice but to evacuate. And in their haste to leave, they set ammunition they couldn't carry and records because they weren't ready to evacuate at all because no one wanted to admit it was about over. In their haste to leave, the Confederates burned Richmond down. In one of the warehouses where they were storing ammunition, it exploded and cannonballs were strewn all over the main square. So if you look here, see all the cannonballs? One of those kind of surreal photos. Lincoln, who was down in Virginia, knowing that it was about over, couldn't resist it on the 3rd with just 12 cavalry troopers guiding him. He went into Richmond and was met by hundreds and stories, even thousands of former slaves, crying, weeping, so happy to see him. There was a really popular song called Lincoln Coming. And it was You Lincoln Coming Now. It was a very popular song. And they were all singing it, and they loved it. It changed him forever. He would never. He said, "This is why we're fighting." In fact, the 12 cavalrymen were from a colored regiment. He had 11 days to live. And so, with that, over the next few days, here in red, Lee is just running away. At Lynchburg, there's a train with some food, they hope. And then he's thinking maybe go to the mountains and fight a guerrilla war. He refused to quit, but his army was falling apart. There'd be one fight here at Sailor's Creek, and then near Appomattox Courthouse, cavalry under George Custer cut him off. And he realizes it's over. So he sent word back and got to Grant to surrender. And so they would meet at Appomattox Courthouse. So this is the home of Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean, they would take his front parlor. McLean actually wasn't from Appomattox Courthouse, just a little tiny town west of Richmond. He used to live in this place called Manassas Junction. And during the first Battle of Bull Run, a cannonball actually went through his back porch. And his wife decided, well, we better move out of here. It's too dangerous. We'll move out of the way to Appomattox Courthouse. So we could rightfully say that the war began in his back porch and ended in his front parlor. Lee, dressed in his finest uniform, showed up. Grant, who rode as fast as he could from behind the line, was in this mud-speckled uniform. He didn't care. And Grant would offer very, very, very lenient terms. Here is the supposed ceremony at Sheridan. Meade couldn't make it. He was too far behind the line. He was furious about this. A few other generals, that's Custer right there. But Grant tried to make small talk before it because he knew Meade was just, or I'm sorry, Lee was just out of it. And he basically said, I remember you from it's called the Old Army. We were both at Chapultepec. And Lee responded with, I don't remember you. Now that was pretty rude in a way. Of course, then Grant remembered, oh yeah, I won. And so he offered them, basically, he paroled his army. They just had to give up their weapons. They paroled their army and provided them food because they were literally starving and let them go home. And there was some anger because a lot of people say, you should arrest the officers. They're the leaders of treason. They're traitors. They try to overthrow the government. But Grant didn't do that. That's to this day, it's debated. And Here's the formal ceremony. The next day, it's a famous painting of it that I stole off of Framery.com. But to accept the surrender was Joshua Lawrence Chin. Remember him? He was commander of the 20th Maine at Little Round Top. Grant and Meade chose him, not only because he was kind of the hero of Gettysburg, but at the Petersburg line, he was a major general by then, but he was as a brigadier general in that last summer, he was horribly wounded, took a musket ball in the gut. In fact, they basically drug him back and he's dead. It's over. No way he'll survive. He was awarded the highest award for valor, created during the war called the Congressional Medal of Honor. And the assumption was he was dead. He not only survived, he would fight again as a major general. And they chose him. I think a pretty good choice. After the war, by the way, Chamberlain would go on to become a 3-term governor of Maine. He would teach every class at Bowdoin College except for math. And would be at every reunion you could imagine of the Army. And would finally die of that ancient wound in 1912. Finally killed. So, with that, these armies surrendered. Now, there's still other armies, but this is the most important army. Davis is fleeing south. He's thinking, I'm going to Texas and fleeing. And so, there's a big celebrations in Washington, D.C. Grant came back. And now what? The war is nearing the end. It's over, essentially. All they got to do is round up the rest. And so with that, let's get back to the plans for the future. What were the plans? Lincoln is going to give the second inaugural address. Now, this is a month before it fell, but we're starting to lay out what's going to happen. And okay. Now, a lot of people talk about his saying one of the most powerful teams with mouth shows none and charity at all, implying that we will try to heal the country. There has to be some kind of reconciliation. But what did that even mean? And he was clear. The South is never going to be the same. And there's Reconstruction. It's going to have to be changed, built again to be part of a different United States. Because 1865 United States is not the same as 1860. It will never be the same. It is a totally different country in many different ways. And also, he taught healing and reconciliation. And after the war, a lot of people said, we're being too tough on the South. We promise reconciliation. Sure. Maybe some from the North, but the South has got to do it too. The North has got to forgive them for being traitors. They're the ones who have to give up something too. And so it was not clear what he meant with reconciliation. We know he was very lenient during the war, but there was going to be something he proposed. Now, here's the deal. Congress will not meet in the summer. So we're really not going to know what Lincoln was planning until after the war completely ended, and then when Congress would meet again. And he always kept his cards close to his face. Didn't want anyone to see his hand. He never let people know. He was that way. He would drive people nuts. He was always kind of manipulating and talking around people. Very clever, very smart. So we don't know what he wanted. And so with that's the last picture taken right after the inauguration. Isn't that a good picture? Look how much he has aged. I don't know why they don't use that picture more. I think that's a really good one. Off to the side, it gives that better view. So that's another picture. I expanded it, and I can't really see it. Right here, watching it, with a pistol in his pocket, is a man by the name of John Wilkes Booth. And he seriously thought about shooting him there. He lost his nerve. But remember, when the inauguration happened, Lee was still fighting. Then Lee surrendered. And Wilkes decided that we must do something about this. Famous actor, He was also part of the militia that watched John Brown be executed. And we're leading up to just 11 days after Richmond fell, Lincoln's assassination. And there's still Confederate armies in North Carolina. Davis is going south, and there's still the Trans-Mississippi West, it's called, west of the Mississippi River. Booth was an actor, and so he could get into places like theaters quite easily because he's a well-known actor, known for being very acrobatic. And he came up with a conspiracy to not just kill Lincoln, but also to kill General Grant, to kill the Secretary of State, Seward, and the Vice President, all in one fell swoop. And there was a combination of revenge, but also he's thinking if the government fell, who knew? Maybe the Confederacy can survive. But it's also revenge. A lot of that. There's a lot of Confederates who joined them, but the actual Confederate government had very little or at all, if any at all, to do with this. And Lincoln was going to go watch My American Cousin, very popular comedy at Ford's Theater. Ulysses Grant was supposed to go with him, so Booth is going to kill him both. But Grant really didn't want to go. He was tired. He just got back, and so Grant's wife acted like she had a horrible headache. So Grant wasn't there. Basil Rathbone replaced him. Whatever. Okay. If you ever get a chance, go to Ford's Theater. It's really cool. It's also really small. It's smaller than our auditorium. It's just so tiny, this little intimate theater. And it's surrounded by much bigger buildings now than Ford's Theater. The Park Service runs a great museum in the basement. They still have plays there. When I was there the first time, they were just setting up to run My American Cousin again. And I thought about going, but we were leaving and it just didn't work out. But if you get a chance, go. And Booth's plan was all this will happen that night. But he, being an actor, could just gain admittance and then hope he could get past the guard, the little balcony seats for Lincoln, get past the guard. Well, at the intermission, the guard decided to go to a local bar and get drunk. And so he wasn't there. So Booth just walked right in. He was carrying a small pistol called a Derringer, has a little bit of black powder so the bullet doesn't move very fast. And from a very short distance, shot Lincoln in the back of it. Grant wasn't there. Major Rathbone's right here, kind of an aide, friend of the family. Huey allowed to go kind of reach for him. Booth pulled out a knife and slashed him in the arm. And then his plan was to make a dramatic jump and leap and land on the stage, and kind of backflip and land on the stage. And then make some profound statement. But that's why Lincoln's holding this, because his foot caught the bunting. He landed awkwardly and shattered his ankle. Major compound fracture. He still got up, said, sic temper tyrannus, or at least that's what people think he said, but wasn't 100% sure. Death to tyrants, and then hobbled on. This is going to begin the biggest manhunt in American history. Eventually, 3 cavalry regiments are going to look for Booth and his Confederates. I should add, I'm talking Confederates as in small c. Confederates are also people who joined him in the conspiracy. And they happen to be Confederates too. So Lincoln took a bullet back here. Didn't go very far in. There was a surgeon who had been with a Union Army surgeon, had dealt with battle wounds, but he didn't have his kit. Normally they have these long metal prods. They're brass prods, and they would stick them into the hole, and they would try to feel the bolt and see if they could remove it. He didn't have it. So what do you do if you don't have it? Use the next best thing. The problem is, in deep cuts, it's temporary, but your body would do something to help it. The blood vessels will spasm, so you won't bleed as much. I mean, they literally shake, keep from bleeding. I've had a really deep cut one time, and the blood vessels shake. It's the weirdest thing. Let me show you. But when he stuck his finger in to feel the bullet, hold it out, it opened up. Lincoln maybe could have survived. Who knows? But maybe without doing it. The doctor did nothing wrong. That's what they were trained to do. Nothing wrong, like he was being irresponsible, but they took Lincoln over to Willard House, this boarding house across the street. While that's going on, the other two assassination attempts, Lewis Powell took a knife and attacked William Seward, the Secretary of State, outside of his home. Chopped up Seward's face, cut off a big hunk of his cheek. But Seward fought him off. George Azeroth, his picture is right there. He lost his nerve and got drunk in a bar. So Johnson, there was no assassination attempt on Johnson. It's like anything else. It's easy to talk big, to actually do it. Azeroth did not have the nerve and didn't want to do it, really. But there are other people who helped him. We don't know all the people who helped him. We have a good idea. And after that, Booth escaped. He would go to his boarding house. Mary Surratt had a boarding house, and her son was part of the conspiracy. Oh, I almost forgot. So they took him over to Willard House. Was in Harper's Magazine. The bed was too small for him, so he had to sleep sideways. And he lived through the night, but was never conscious and would die that morning. If you go there today, that's also part of it's a national park inside Washington, D.C. The theater and Willard House. The bed and the place is exactly the way it was on the 15th when they removed his body. It has the same sheets and the same type. And so they are now black with his blood. Still there. And when I heard about that, my thought was the same as yours. You know, it works. It doesn't, it's just like, yeah, it's respectful. They did a good job. They did a really good job. Once again, if you get a chance, go. It's like anything else. I'll say that about a lot of places, and I mean them sincerely. If you get a chance, go. So this huge reward, given the Confederates, picked up weapons here, went to a Dr. Mudd. Mudd was he was allied, they knew him, he set his leg, but he couldn't really walk. They would eventually escape and be captured by cavalry 10 days later at Garrett's farm. And on 26th, in a gunfight that also caught the barn on fire they were hiding in, Booth would be killed. So he was killed right before they captured him. Maybe he was shot, maybe they could have saved him, but he died. And the rest of the Confederates were caught. There'd be a massive trial. And here's 4 of the, just after they were hung. So you can see the trap door. See the trap door? That's right here. So it broke their neck. And do you notice one of them here? That's Mary Surratt. In this desire for revenge, just bloodlust, she would be convicted of treason, even though it's doubtful she was a part of the conspiracy. She might have known, and that's a crime, not telling. But she was not, almost certainly not one of the actual conspirators. But they were so desperate for revenge, she was murdered. Executed. And now you have President Andrew Johnson. A Southern Democrat is now president with a vast majority of the members of the House, Republicans, and virtually everybody in Congress is a Northerner. Johnson, who really didn't want to be president, didn't like any of the Republican programs. He just hated the planter class in the South. He was so nervous before he was going to be sworn in that the Secretary of the Navy got him getting well. Said, why don't you have a drink of brandy? That'll calm you down. He proceeded to drink a 5th of brandy and was drunk out of his mind when he was sworn in and could hardly stand up. He gave a speech and he got lost and was slurring. Reason I'm telling you that? A bad sign for this presidency. That's how it began. Well, the fighting still is going on, and Johnson is president. The last major Confederate army under Joseph D. Johnston, once again, he took overall command early in the year and gave the remnants of Confederate forces in North Carolina to Johnston. Sherman followed him down, and eventually, after one battle, Johnston would surrender. And you notice it's 12 days after Lincoln's assassination, the last major army. And Johnston and Sherman were already friends before the war, become very close friends afterward. And in 1889, when Johnston died, Sherman was one of his followers. It was a really cold, wet, rainy day. And Sherman was all getting very up there too. Did not wear his hat to show respect. Cold, pneumonia. He died of heart attack. And so with that, Davis was caught about 9 days later in Georgia. He was wearing a shawl to try to hide himself to slip through cavalry without his cavalry screens everywhere trying to run him down. And so they claimed he was dressed like a woman, and that was seen as a big insult to the manly men of the North. But look at the reward. About 8 million now. So, with that, and they jailed him for 2 years in perpetual light. And they try to decide, should we try him or not? And yes, try him for treason. Well, we got to wait and wait and wait and wait. And then Johnston would pardon. He couldn't hold office again, but he would be pardoned. And so after this, now we're unified. But can you really have unification? Can you really forgive each other after all of these dead? Now, when I was in school, and you still see this in books, you still see it in your textbook, about 618,000. Well, over half died of disease during the war. This is from Gettysburg. But we're almost 100% sure that's not true. It's much closer to 1 million. They way undercounted the number of deaths. Way undercounted. And so you'll see figures as high as 950,000 to 1 million. And so that's 1 out of every 10 men. And so after the war, it's just going to be grief. And it's going to be sorrow. And it's going to be this whole generation of men who will never be the same. Never be the same. You see something similar after World War I and World War II. Just never be the same. And you're going to see this wave of monument building in the North right after the war to remember this. Not really in the South because they were pretty broken. They'll have a wave of monument building in the 1890s, but that's for a different reason. And we'll get to that down the road. And so can they really come back together? And this graph, okay, this is almost certainly wrong, but I put it up there to give you an idea of how much more, or how much bloodier it was, even in World War II, which had over 16 million men and women in uniform. Yet still, what a bloodbath. And it's pre-high explosives. This has about 6,100 for Iraq and Afghanistan. It's over 8,000. Yeah.
Or how much longer were we in Civil War than World War II?
About the same amount of time. Now, there was a difference about healthcare, and it's certainly not American citizens fighting American citizens. But still, World War II and the numbers, it's pretty amazing. And if you look at these wars up here, there's significantly more men died in 1862 than died in all previous American wars combined. And so, after the war, we will dub this Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction is basically a threefold thing. What to do about the South? Now, the first one, yes, it is. Much of the South was destroyed. Even areas that they weren't fighting, it was destroyed. They couldn't repair things. They couldn't fix things. Things fell apart. And so it was rebuilt. And that was a legitimate part of it. And also, Reconstruction meant that the political, the economic system of the South, they're going to come back into the Union, be integrated in the Union. They're going to have to be changed. I can't emphasize this enough. 1865 is a totally different country than 1860. And what we think of as the United States is 1865 and afterwards. The Civil War is this climactic moment where the old is forever left behind. Maybe we've had other situations close to this. Who knows? But then there's something else. What about the former slaves? They called them freedmen. remember what Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address? This would be, and if you believe in equal rights, I'm going to use the term noble, an effort to bring. They really tried. They really tried. And it worked. And by 1890s, almost all the rights somebody fought and died for would be taken. When the civil rights movement would come back again in the 1950s and 1960s, and it crescendo 64, 65, 1964, 65. Those weren't for new rights. Those were to get back the rights that they had fought and lost from Reconstruction. That's probably the reason why it makes it so tragic. You had to wait that long. And even then, it was always incomplete. But yeah, this was a noble fight. They tried, despite the propaganda afterwards. And I will be told something different when I was in school. And so we have two different types of Reconstruction, presidential and then congressional. Sometimes you see this called radical Reconstruction. Radical as in you believe in equal rights, radical. Or sometimes you see it called Republican Reconstruction, but most of the time you see it as congressional and presidential. So this is presidential initiative, and then Congress will take over. And Grant would become president and try. Grant had issues, but Grant would try. And so with that. But the first big element, this would be Lincoln's real big push before he was inaugurated for a second term, was for the 13th Amendment. He got it passed by 2/3 of the Congress before he was inaugurated. And then it went to the states and got 3/4 of the state by 1865. He wanted this done before the war ended. To end slavery. It was a big deal. I think on that list of terms I give you the movie Lincoln, and it's good about this. It was on Netflix. I don't know if it still is. It is? You checked? Oh, shoot. I'm sorry. That's one of the things now. You know, movies come, movies go. And I know Glory was too, but I don't know if it is now either. You might have to rent it or pay, I know, I'm sorry. Like anything else. But there's still slavery as punishment for a crime. So if you're arrested, you can go to hard labor, and they can work you without pay or almost no pay. And that is still the way it is today. And yes, there would be units of the brand new things called police. Police are still very new at this time. That would just simply round up people to be used as prisoners, and they would rent them out to people as slave laborers after the war. We'll come back to this. And it's no coincidence the 13th Amendment, it was not yet ratified, but they've heard about it. So Juneteenth, it's June 16th, June 19th, 1865, in Galveston, which had been under attack and blockaded. Union forces tried to take it in 1863, failed, but blockading it. Union forces entered it in June. The last Confederate forces in Texas surrendered 3 weeks early. So they surrendered in May. In fact, the last battle of the Civil War, I think it's called Gravelly Run, was a small Confederate victory, one of those weird little quirks of history. So when Union forces arrived at Galveston, they'd heard about the Emancipation Proclamation. But when they were told on that June 19th, I don't want to say June 16th, June 19th, it's just celebration. And so amongst former slaves, that became kind of a day to celebrate emancipation. So even though the 13th Amendment had not been ratified, in a way it celebrates the Emancipation Proclamation, which only freed slaves in areas controlled by the Confederacy. So they were freed by that, and the 13th Amendment. And it was known, there was some celebrations in some areas, but just a couple years ago, this became a federal holiday to remember the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation. And a very fitting day. Very fitting day when they found that out. So I tie that in there just so I could mention it. But one important thing about the 13th Amendment, it said nothing about rights. It never said voting. It never said citizenship. It just simply said you're free. And then what are they? They're in limbo. I should add, as soon as slaves were freed, one of the first things they did, if they could, is they hit the road to try to find their family. First things they did. Yeah. The civilizing thing about slavery. They try to find their family. Well, that's the 13th Amendment. So there's a big hole in this. What are they? And how do you tell those hundreds of thousands of soldiers who fought for the United States to say, but you're not quite citizens? And so, also created in 1865 was this group called the Friedmans Bureau. And it had high expectations, but it was never funded. And it was going to provide some education, food, seeds, aid for former slaves known as freedmen. Also protection from white democratic mobs. But it was very limited. The Friedmans Bureau would be in existence for 14 years. And the total 14 years of the Friedmans Bureau was the equivalent of about 1 day of spending during the Civil War in 1864. The United States has never really given much for these kind of things. You're talking about Texas and not providing buses? This is the United States. We don't provide much for people. That's why school is such an amazing thing. You won't see it afterwards. Not much happened. I mean, they give a lot, especially the veterans, but not as much as they could. And Southern whites, especially Democrats, and I didn't put out Democrats, but Democratic whites, and also Northern Democrats, they did everything they could to discredit it, even though it was tiny, by claiming they're just giving money to these lazy former slaves. And here they are relaxing and just doing nothing while white people work and they do nothing. This idea, remember, this comes from the positive good theory, that they're lazy black. So they said it over and over again. And it's horrifically racist, right, in dividing people more by race. Horrifically racist. This picture's kind of shocking, isn't it? And they did everything they could to discredit it. And you will see this thing, it says right here, it says the popular idea of the Friedmans Bureau, plenty to eat and nothing to do, meaning they're just lazy unless you make them work. And that was the whole essence of the positive good theory. And one more thing that happened with the Friedmans Bureau, a bunch of Northerners started going south. And Southern white Democrats would start calling them carpetbaggers. Now, most of them were educators or soldiers, but some were speculators trying to get rich off the poverty of the South. And there's carpetbag, imagine a square piece of carpet. You fold it, sew the sides, put a latch on it, cheap luggage. But here's from a textbook, and it has a little poem in there to an old textbook from the 1970s. And there's a carpetbagger stealing money. And you notice it's a wounded veteran of the Confederacy. It says, the fallen South. And it says, carpetbaggers, it's pitifully plain, use Southern defeat for personal gain. It's a beautiful poem, isn't it? So, last thing for today. President Johnson would initiate what's called presidential reconstruction. During the war, Lincoln would initiate what's called the 10% plan for areas occupied by the United States. It's a wartime plan. If you give an oath, you got amnesty. Amnesty means you can't be charged with treason. And if 10% gave the oath, the state's back in the Union. 10% of their population from the 1860 census. This is shockingly lenient. I mean, this is like, what? All you got to do is swear an oath and everything you did is forgotten? Lincoln was doing this in 1864 because we had Tennessee and Louisiana in the Union. He's trying to make it look like the U.S. is winning. This is a wartime program to look like the U.S. is winning the Civil War. We're bringing states into the Union. By no means was this going to be Johnson's plan. It became Lincoln's plan after the war. It became Johnson's plan. Johnson wanted the lenient policy. All they had to do is write a new constitution and add the 13th Amendment, all is forgiven. How soon do you suppose southern states came back in the Union and all you needed was 10% to swear a loyalty oath. By the end of the summer, every single state of the former Confederacy was back in the Union. All back in. And there was only a promise, someday we'll give rights. It never said citizenship, it just said rights. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, was elected back to his old seat in Congress, just showed up in Washington, D.C. like nothing ever happened. Needless to say, members of Congress were nuts and wouldn't see them. And on that happy note, I will probably see you tomorrow